There are only a few weapons and materials within the Star Wars universe that can resist the power of a lightsaber. We're exploring these very menacing tools in two parts. First, through what is considered as part of the official Star Wars canon and could make its way into new Star Wars films. And then we have the more obscure, expanded universe weapons and materials that can resist lightsabers. These, of course, would be classified as legends. As Ahsoka once said, there's always some truth in legends. So let us begin. First of all, we need to briefly understand the lightsaber powered by a kyber crystal, which is unique to each Jedi or Sith. Lightsaber shot out an intimidating plasma blade. Lightsabers are so powerful they could cut through solid metallic doors, and usually the only way to defend against one is with another lightsaber, of course. So you could just see how intimidating they can be. However, there are those willing to go up against the power of a lightsaber. We saw several examples of this on screen. It's thought that Captain Phasma's armor uses what is called ultrachrome, which was used in starship armor during the Great Sith War. It could easily deflect blaster fire, but get this, was also resistant to, you guessed it, the lightsaber. But Captain Phasma wasn't the only one that used lightsaber-resistant materials in their suit. In fact, Darth Vader also took it upon himself to use what is called Mandalorian iron in his gloves. And remember when Han Solo was shooting at him on Bespin? Well, it explains how his hands could take such brute force of the blaster fire. There's also a special circumstance in a battle against Lone Star. Lone Star's lightsaber simply bounced off his helmet. This bit would count as legends though, so keep that in mind, but his suit was designed to take as much of a brutal beating as possible from his foes. And of course we have the infamous Magna Guard, who is ready to rock and roll with his Electro Staff. Electro Staffs are no joke. In fact, they can stop your heart only after 5 seconds of making contact, so you want to stay as far away from them as possible. But more importantly, they can counter lightsabers with ease. Of course, most famously, General Grievous's bodyguards fought against Jedi with these. And more recently, we saw the riot baton being used by FN 2199. You may also know him as Traitor. He served on a squad with Finn and felt deeply betrayed by him. Well, of course, obviously, FN 2199 was classified as a riot control trooper who was tasked to maintain control and crush any rebellions or uprisings within the local population. The riot baton, however, was only designed to intimidate and not to kill, but this was one of the few weapons that could take on a Jedi's lightsaber that wasn't another lightsaber. And you may remember on several occasions our Jedi getting trapped in these shields. You'll notice they make no attempt to get free in this scene. It's because these tricky things are also known as ray shields, which can completely deflect or scatter the power of a lightsaber. Not good for a Jedi at all. In fact, Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Palpatine were trapped by the ray shield. Both Anakin and Obi-Wan jokingly made remarks that they were smarter than this. Well, apparently not. Ray shields are so powerful, in fact, that Imperials used them to protect the Spire, a very large prison where Darth Maul was held by Darth Sidious before he escaped to assist the Death Watch. Getting in or out of the prison would be nearly impossible thanks to the ray shields. Don't expect to be cutting your way in with your lightsaber. Now it's time to drop by some of the more crazy Legends versions of lightsaber resistant weapons and materials. These would likely not end up in films or TV, but it's really cool to explore. But then again, you know, Disney does have a way of making Legends materials into official canon materials. They've been doing it with Rebels and stuff like that, so who knows? So we'll begin with the Wild Amphistaff, which was a genetically engineered serpentine creature that acted as a primary anti-personnel weapon of the Yuuzhan Vong. This weapon made the Vong absolutely feared by the Jedi, as they were able to resist a lightsaber's plasma. In fact, the serpent could wrap itself around the blade, pulling the poor victim closer to the Vong, while the serpent's head reached out and began attacking. I mean, can you imagine this? It was the ultimate anti-Jedi weapon, able to lock a Jedi in his place and attack at the same time. Now, amphistaffs were not just created at some random factory or molded by Forge. They were actually grown. Yes, you heard right. This was a living weapon that had to be grown from leathery pulps. They would eventually break off from the pulp and roam the forest where they would survive. What comes next is most impressive indeed. This weapon can see in infrared lighting, making it an excellent weapon for dark conditions, and proved to be one of the Vong's most trusted tools against its enemies. And Darth Bane wore what was called Orbalisk armor, which was a parasitic creature. They would latch on their host and multiply, eventually smothering their poor host in the process. That would be freaking frightening. However, with some creativity, some hosts managed to prevent the Orbalisk from encompassing the face, giving them the ability to wear armor that was immune to a lightsaber strike. And get this, Orbalisk caused the wearer to feel pain, fueling their dark side power, and if they were to die with the armor on, it would release a potent toxin in the host's body. That sounds like quite a good time for sure. The Felucian Shaman were a group of talented Force users in the galaxy. They could use the Force to defend and heal their people, and could be found in the Forest of Felucia. It was known as a very Force-rich planet. These shaman used a primitive weapon dubbed the Felucian Skullblade, which were constructed from the skull and teeth of creatures native to the planet. Now, these creatures were so special because within them were Force-reactive crystals, which were quite similar to those constructed in lightsabers. But the shaman didn't stop just with the more regular creatures on Felucia. In fact, they were also using something called the Rancor Bone Blade, which was imbued with the Force and, like the Skullblade, was also resistant to the lightsaber. It's obvious this weapon was built from the bones of, you guessed it, a Rancor. Now, Galen Merrick also came across these weapons when he encountered Felucians wielding such impressive weapons. There were also several materials within the Star Wars universe that could resist a lightsaber as well. The Von Dun crab armor was used by the Vong and was powered by the same energy that the Amphistaff carried, making lightsabers pretty much obsolete against it. New Cortosis was a super rare but brittle material that caused lightsabers to actually short out upon contact. Of course, this was only temporary, but I imagine it threw off many Jedi in battle. Cortosis could also be lined in armor. In fact, it was used on Shadow Trooper armor and also Cortosis battle droids during the Clone Wars. The Imperial Palace also embraced this material too, protecting it from any Jedi that wanted to cut their way through. What makes Cortosis so useful is it could line practically anything, walls, melee weapons, armor, but unfortunately the problem was it was so rare and extremely expensive to mine because of that rarity. There were a few other lightsaber resistant materials as well, including Frick, a metallic compound that was nearly indestructible and was used in the construction of both battle armor and melee weapons. The canon version of Frick was actually used in Emperor Palpatine's lightsaber too, the more you know. And Song Steel was a super lightweight silver metal that was used in swords and staves and was considered highly resistant to lightsaber strikes. So there you guys have it, a complete history of weapons that are resistant to lightsabers. So many cool weapons. I'm curious to see if any of these Legends weapons also become canon as well.